Okay, upper sixth, here we are. So, bullet point 1B, ethics. I have a confession. I did not enjoy this. So, took some basic notes that we took from our good friend Ian and did some research around them to add some flesh to them. I wish I wouldn't have started. So, I think the key essence of this part of the research bullet is not to focus on some of the stories that you're going to find online. We've talked about the Primark factory collapse and fire in Bangladesh, where over 1,000 people died. We've talked about ethical consideration issues in the Nike supply chain when they were first caught having children work in their factories, and how from the 1990s it took pressure groups, it took celebrity sports people, it took basically people boycotting the brand before they sorted out their supply chain. We now see this evolving to the next stage where we're more aware of the environment, for example, and the impact of methane with animals, and how vegan leather is normally oil-based products, which is probably just as bad for the planet as making them out of cows. But even that started to evolve in a more positive way, actually. So we see some vegan leather made out of either recycled plastic, so it's good to use that, and also coconut and apple peel and loads of other stuff I didn't know before this morning, actually. So it's moving in the right direction in some ways because of documentaries like Blue Planet, for example. We're more aware of sustainability and environmentalism and global warming. And this brings us on nicely to air miles with fashion. Now, unless our press tell us about this, or we research before we buy a nice jumper, we won't know about it. So raising awareness of this is quite important for those, probably for those brands in competition with the companies that basically fly their clothes in from China. So, in some ways, it's a bit shocking to see that some companies don't do more of this. Zara, for example, are well known for making their clothes in Spain and Portugal. Well, even they're making lots of clothes in the Southeast Asia, for example. And another downside of making most of your clothes in Spain and Portugal is you then need to transport them. And Zara mainly transport using aeroplanes, one of the most polluting forms of transport known to man on the planet. So we'll explore this jolly topic as we go through without trying to make it too sensational, clearly. But you should focus on the value that companies can add to their brands. What could they do? Why is this important to customers? Will I pay more money? Won't I pay more money? Is this a role of legislation to step in? Is this a role of reshoring? Well, we'll have a look through that in a bit. So here's some of the things. I was thinking about PESTLE with this, and if there's political will, for example, the environment we've mentioned, social is up there. Technology, well, that could be technology of transportation. This could be technology of, isn't it great to have 3 seasons of clothes every year? And then the rest of them get burnt because obviously the luxury brands don't really want us to be able to buy cheap products from TK Maxx. Some of them would rather set fire to them. So in lots of ways, this is a bit of a problem. The legal side of it is linked into pressure groups. Those pressure groups raising awareness with consumers, with legislators. So it's quite important to understand the role of this. And obviously we've got ethics in there as well. So, and the economy, I should say. So we have to think about these things as those external factors that could influence businesses. We also need to think back to our good friend Peter Drucker, bless him. The purpose of a company is to increase shareholder wealth. Now, lots of times that quote is taken out of context, and some people will say, well, it's all about profitability. Well, Drucker was talking about long-term profitability, where you invest in staff, you invest in your supply chains, and hopefully everyone makes profit in the long term. However, lots of pressure on PLCs. Go back to form of business again. Shareholders buy shares to make profit in the form of dividends or their share price going up. Share prices normally go up if you pay reasonable dividends, or there's the belief that there will be good return on investment in the future. If a company is losing money but they're saving the planet, well, how sustainable is that business model? Very difficult not to jump on a soapbox here, but we will move on. So here's some articles for you to possibly look at. There are a lot more out there. And when we're talking about sweatshops, lots of you will be thinking about those Nike factories in the 1990s, and since, by the way, where kids were making trainers, or you had the Apple documentary on Netflix where people were falling asleep whilst making your lovely iPhones. Well, the good thing is they're closing those factories in China. Not because of working conditions, probably because the Chinese government shut all the factories during COVID because they couldn't therefore make enough iPhones then. That's not good for share price. And they're moving them to India, which have probably got just as bad human rights records as the early day Chinese. So again, our most beloved high-priced technology brands look like they're moving their manufacturing for profit reasons, but it is the nature of capitalism, maybe. But you need to remember that sweatshops aren't always just outside of the UK. Now, this is an interesting article. If you read it, it's a great example of how newspapers, and in this case the BBC, will use sensational language to sell newspapers or get us to go onto their news services to justify my license fee. So they use the word sweatshop, but when you read the article, one of the people were on £6 per hour. Now, this is below the minimum wage. It is against the law, but I wouldn't necessarily consider this as a sweatshop. When Iceland, the frozen food manufacturer, were caught underpaying their staff because they refused to pay for PPE, which brought their workers under the national minimum wage, or now the living wage rebranded, they weren't accused of sweatshop labour. They were just accused of a breach of minimum wage legislation. So lots of the times with sweatshop labour, we're not just thinking about low wages, we're thinking about other working conditions. For example, when these poor factory workers were not allowed to leave the building when the fire alarm was going because it was probably faulty, and then the building collapsed around them and over 1,000 people died in the pursuit of £2 t-shirts for Primark. Clearly this is a sweatshop. There's multiple factors. There might be forced labour, there might be poor health and safety, there might be lack of trade union representation. So there's lots of other factors, not just low pay. So please don't just focus on low pay, even though pay is a factor potentially. You should think that actually one of the reasons we outsource to Bangladesh in this case to make our textiles is because even though the Leicester sweatshop was breaking the minimum wage legislation, £6 an hour compared to probably a textile worker in Bangladesh is significantly more money. So, we're thinking about, why do we outsource? Why do we all buy clothes that were made in China or Vietnam or India? Well, it's because they're cheaper. So we need to think about that when we're buying clothes. There's a wonderful term that we've all come across, which is greenwashing. And there are lots of companies out there that will tell us what they're doing to improve their brands. Now, quite a lot of this, when we looked at the controlling multinational corporations unit, we thought of one way of doing it is to just outsource all the stuff. Outsource the labour, outsource the health and safety, outsource the checking of our supply chain factories. So instead of, for example, sorry if this is slandering Primark checking on their factory in Bangladesh, Maybe they sign up to a safety standard, and that safety standard, based on the money that Primark pay them for membership of this safety standard, pays workers to go to the factories. Now, you imagine if that factory failed that safety standard, what do Primark do? Well, officially Primark will just walk away probably and go and find someone else. So there's a lot of incentive for people to pass those safety standards. How good are those safety standards? As a consumer in the UK, I generally don't have a clue. When we did the chocolate theme a few years ago and we looked at fair trade chocolate, companies like Nestle just invented their own fair trade version and they called it Fair Life. So, actually we have to maybe look into these things as consumers. And generally, if I'm buying a £2 t-shirt, I'm buying it because it's £2. Okay? And we can see there's more exploitation in the UK fashion industry. We need to look at what that means. There's lots of stuff out there. Pressure groups are key. So here's a good example of a pressure group. Lots of very good information on their website. It's well worth having a look at some of these charity organisations that are there to help. So we've got obviously Clean Clothes up here. We've got Shape Charity, and there's lots of these types of pressure groups out there. So think about some of these. Greenpeace have obviously been around forever and a day and focus on a lot to do with the environment, which is quite interesting. And we'll talk more about planned obsolescence a little bit later. There's some additional reading if you want to there, and there's more. So if we think about sweatshops, low wages, we have to put it into context. Now, I'm guessing that most of you, if you're my students, haven't worked. Okay, maybe you've had a little bit of work experience. Maybe some of you, not many, may have a bar job at the weekends, and you've done a bit of summer work. Some of you might work with your parents on the farm. Is that child labour? Was that child labour when you first drove your first tractor? Was it child labour when you worked every single school holiday with your family? Well, of course not, because it's not just about you being a child. Have you got access to education? Have you got access to healthcare? Are you allowed at the age of 5 to run around with a chainsaw? Well, clearly not, hopefully not. And we also need to think about excessive hours. A 12-hour day sounds like an excessive amount of hours. Well, not really. I think from the age of 16, leaving school, I've rarely worked less than a 10 to 12-hour day. The job I'm currently in, obviously as a Dalmatian, in term time, I'll be lucky if I do a 12-hour day, 6 days per week. And then we get obviously copious amounts of holiday where I can record these videos for you. So if you think about it, look at our junior doctors. They're always, well, not always, that's a wrong word, level 2 assertion, sir. They're going on strike, excessive hours, underpaid. Underpaid compared to what? Not underpaid compared to a Bangladeshi textile worker, that's for a fact. However, they are the backbone of the NHS and we should look after them. How many of them work 80-hour weeks and are tired? How many mistakes happen because of that? Well, on the textile industry, we need to be aware of a comparison. The comparison to low pay might be no pay. It might be that in a small family-run cotton plantation that there are children working on the cotton plantation, but in the afternoons they go to school, and because of the work they do, their parents can afford healthcare. Well, if you look under anything that is related to the cotton standards that are out there, Cotton Alliance, sorry, I couldn't remember the words, you'll see that they talk about children working in family-run farms, and as long as they're in education, they're not classed as child workers. If there are child workers that don't have access to education and they're in work instead of that, well, that's the stuff that British retailers will not tolerate anymore if they know about it. So we're thinking about the word enforced there, being forced. You're not allowed to do anything unless the employer tells you. We could be holding back wages, for example. And there are examples of this. And I was reading earlier on the net preparing this, how Nike have been accused of owing millions upon millions of dollars to workers in their supply chain who they've just basically refused to pay. Now, if they're in the supply chain for Nike, are they direct employees? Probably not. So who's refusing to pay them? But Nike are getting the bad press. Is this Nike refusing to pay the subcontractor and therefore they've refused to pass it on? I don't know. But I bet lots of newspapers were sold that day. And it is a horrible story. What Nike should have done is contractually made sure that that money was going to be passed on to the workers. Do they have that level of contact with their supply chain? I don't think so. So here's some examples. There was a flood. You can read the screen. It's a horrible story. They had underground workshops. People were being electrocuted. And more importantly, without reading everything, it's directly linked to the supply chain of Zara. Okay, now I don't tend to read many articles about Zara's appalling supply chain because we think most of their stuff is made in Spain and Portugal and therefore in the European Union, therefore lots and lots of worker protection, rights to have a trade union, health and safety legislation, which hopefully they're following. So we tend to, when I say we, I mean the press, we tend to ignore them in the press unless something really went wrong, of course, like this type of story. Now, whereas if it was Primark, they step 1 foot out of line and the press will be all over them because they know this sensational story will definitely get people, in a fury. And quite rightly so, they should. But what are the press ignoring? Why aren't we hearing about other ethical considerations? Why aren't the UK government stepping in and saying to Primark and Zara and others, if you don't follow ethical practices, we're going to fine you? We fine the water industry for pollution. Why can't we fine the fast fashion industry? Maybe because it's worth so much money to the economy. Not really sure, because the poor retailers are losing so much money as it is. Or are they? Another one we've talked about extensively, and we've already mentioned it in this video, so I won't go on about this. But more importantly, the ILO have praised Bangladesh for its progress since 2013. So this horrible story has led to changes in legislation. And we've seen this throughout the history. We have corporate manslaughter legislation in the UK because of a horrible rail disaster where senior managers basically ignored health and safety. That was in the UK not so long ago. Well, for an old dog like me, not so long ago. And we've also seen that they are encouraging trade unions, and we understand from the lower sixth that the purpose of a trade union is to fight for workers' rights, workers' pay, all of those sorts of things, including health and safety in the building not collapsing around your ears. So actually, this is a really big thing if this is happening in the textiles industry. When workers get power, they get those rights to vote and possibly go on strike. Now, remember, the point of a trade union is to fight for workers' rights. More health and safety equals more costs for the supply chain. More workers' rights, maybe they fight for better pay, increase the cost of your garments. Now, will Primark, for example, pay these increased prices? If they are willing to, will we be willing to pay £3 for our t-shirt instead of £2? Somewhere in the supply chain, there might be someone making less money and maybe they're taking shortcuts. Maybe it's further down the supply chain past this factory that we don't actually see because we're not aware of the cotton growers, for example. So it's very interesting how this has been pushed down the supply chain. And every time I walk into Primark, when I'm dragged into Primark, I see lots of posters up talking about the Cotton Alliance and ethical supply chains and how they look after their workers throughout the world. They're very proud of it. They need to constantly remind us of this, by the way, so we think they're an ethical company. So this led to lots of protests, which we talk about in class. £2 t-shirts cost lives, those sorts of things. We then saw, I'll clip this off their website, they talk about the sustainability of their supply chain, and they're very proud of the standards they've signed up to. And this is a lovely picture of a lovely, bright and clean, and it looks sort of modern factory. So we can see that their partners are there, and they're talking about credentials of very well-respected organisations like the OECD, and they talk about due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains. So they're signing up to these international standards. Who's checking if they're following them would be one of my questions. Is this an independent consultancy, or is this Primark's own staff? I'm hoping it's Primark's own staff, because then there might be more of a chance of just going in and holding people accountable to their contracts. If the suppliers are at risk of losing their contracts, then there's a better chance of them actually following these due diligence guidance and the United Nations guiding principles and human rights and all those sorts of things. So these are really, really good guidance, but the skeptical person in me is thinking, who's checking? And is this a profit-making organisation, a third party that specialises in checking stuff? Or is it Primark? So they're meeting with the experts. They've got a team of experts, and their partners talk all things talk all things ethics and sustainability, and how we are working together to give our clothes a longer life. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? When we go on to built-in obsolescence a little bit later, longer life. I was watching a documentary the other month, and they were talking about destinations of clothes. You donate your unwanted clothes to a local charity shop. If they can't sell them, or during COVID when they just had so many, it was unbelievable. They bag it up and they sell it off by weight. Generally what happens is it gets shipped off to a third world country, and then it's unpacked, it's sold on local markets, and there's a whole industry around it. However, the growth in fast fashion means that the locals are simply dumping quite a lot of the fast fashion clothes into landfill. Top tip, everyone. If you've got fast fashion clothes that you think are stretched out of all condition, don't give it to your local charity shop. They're either going to pay for it to be landfilled, or they're going to send it to the other side of the planet to be landfilled. Chop it up, use it to clean your car or something. So we can see, this is from Primark's website, they talk about traceability and compliance, which is a new buzzword in food and obviously in clothes nowadays. They talk about lots of statistics, and they're very, very happy about their products. Okay, how they're going to save the planet, how many female workers they've got working for them, and how they will look after their rights. Okay, so we shall see. I've read some articles after the collapsed building in Bangladesh, where the pressure was pushed down the supply chain to be more ethical, to follow health and safety and everything else, because companies like Primark refused to pay any more money for their clothes, because we refused to pay more than £2 for a t-shirt. What they were doing is they were basically running it a little bit like a work camp. And people weren't allowed breaks, and they were holding back on wages. And every time they got near piecework targets, your piecework that we've looked at before as a commission structure in some ways, as one of those bonuses per t-shirt that's made to the right standard, they would move the targets even further so people couldn't earn the money. Well, if this is something that Primark is aware of, well, I've read an article about it, so I presume they are. What are they doing about that? Yes, health and safety is improved. Yes, workers are being spoken to, but how are they being managed to make sure they're still hitting these volume and quality targets to keep the prices down? Lots of questions. So child labour, We haven't heard a lot about this recently. I've already gone on quite a lot about it. This is one of those red lines. If we hear about child labour, the government will probably intervene in the UK, and we generally don't like it. When, for example, we were getting notes in some of our Christmas cards, I think this was Tesco's a couple of Christmases, from Uyghur refugees. Clearly, that didn't go down well in the press, and Tesco's would have stopped buying cards from that factory. So we need to be very aware that they promise they are going to eradicate it, and if you can't, then most British companies will not work with these companies. So it makes me think that they're going to promise. And hopefully they've got recruitment policies that won't give jobs to children that aren't in education, and aren't getting that health care. Well, hopefully. So if they don't like it, they're just going to pull the contracts. This can have a negative impact on local economies as well. There's lots of videos and documentaries on inner city India, for example, with street children. Obviously, one of the charities at school we sponsor and donate to is Street Child. So we have to think about the long-term impact of withdrawal. So is that the right strategy? Well, maybe it is, but what about the short-term consequences of that? Not really in the research theme, though. So we've got 14-year-old workers in Myanmar. Now, this brings us into legislation. So is that illegal in Myanmar? And if it isn't illegal, then is it ethical in that country? Do we find it unethical because our working age is 16, as long as you're in education, 18 if you're not? Well, my mum's not that old. She left school at 15, and that's only 1 year's difference than Myanmar. Well, we can see that's 7 years ago from the article that I clipped out of The Guardian. So is that unethical, or is that local employment standards? Well, because of the way that most consumers in the UK look at ethical employment, maybe as a consumer I find that unacceptable. So H&M will probably go to the Myanmar textile company and basically say, don't employ anyone under the age of 16 because our consumers can't cope with it. If there's no formal education after the age of 14 and they're meant to work, if this is the only local employer, is this really good for the local environment for these people? I don't know. Lots of unanswered questions there, but just thinking back to, the 1960s when my mum left school at 15. Not that long ago. Clearly, more articles we've seen, and this was obviously a double whammy for Marks and Spencer's. They didn't know that in the Turkish factories there were not only children, but there were refugee children. So clearly this is really bad, looking at the headline here, because it could be that, and it sounds like it from the article, that these children were being taken advantage of. They weren't being paid a lot above board and a bit of food, and they were working excessive hours. There was no education, and clearly this is something that we should not tolerate in any of our supply chains. I'm quite confident Marks and Spencer's didn't know about it, but why didn't they know about it is the bit that I'm not happy about as a consumer. They should know about their supply chains. So labour force bullying is a huge issue in the UK. There's lots of workplace bullying, unfortunately. We have discrimination legislation with those protected characteristics that we talk about in the lower sixth, but general bullying unfortunately goes on, and as long as you've got good policies and the laws there with lots of case law in the UK, then it's there to protect you. Trade unions, again, if you're a member. If not, you've got ACAS you can go to, Citizens Advice Bureau. There's a really good system for supporting workers in the UK. Could be better, but so could all systems. However, when we compare this to emerging markets, which may not have those supports, systems, legislation, might treat different genders, ethnic groups differently, then we may have problems. And I gave you the Tesco's example just now without repeating it. So, we're thinking about this, and this is the article. It was actually an academic paper from Essex University. So they looked at the controls post Rana Plaza disaster. That's the textile factory in Bangladesh that collapsed. And they found actually there was a lot of bullying that went on there. So frequent wage cuts, setting movable targets, carrying out intense observations. Don't know what that is. I haven't read the full article. Maybe there's a little bit of extra reading there for you. But it's fascinating how this article, and this is only one I've seen, by the way, I haven't peer reviewed it. This could be extreme ways of dealing with making sure you're following Primark's rules, or you're going to lose your contract. So this is the way we will manage you. You will be safe. Well, that intense supervision may be bullying, which is no good. So the solutions, well, clearly we've seen from the praise that the Bangladeshi government were given post that disaster. Well, trade union representation. It's really important that you understand that trade unions can be a force for good. And when I teach about trade unions in class, lots of people think that trade unions are a bit of a pain, going on strike so I can't use the train during school holidays and stuff like that. But actually, trade unions are there to represent. They're there to negotiate with employers where individual workers may not have representation. And yes, they can go on strike. I'm sure it's absolute last resort, by the way, because they don't want to damage the employers they're working for. But you need to be very mindful that trade unions are a force for good. And if you look back at worker legislation in the UK, lots of it has originated through trade unions. So yes, they can be a pain when they cancel the trains, but think of the reasoning behind it. Okay, independent, trustworthy, unannounced factory inspections. This could be some of the things that they could do. Well, you could have assessed the likely impact on Primark's supply chain of closer supervision of subcontractor contracts. You won't get anything that complicated. I just made that one up. Yes, it's an extra cost, which might need to be passed on to consumers in a price-sensitive fast fashion market. Maybe we're not tolerant of that. Maybe Primark need to make less profits. Then you think about the added value this might have in the supply chain. Primark are probably one scandal away from being boycotted by a lot of UK consumers. However, the last time they had those protests, £2 t-shirts cost lives. After all the protesters left, I'm quite confident the only thing people remembered were £2 t-shirts. The last bullet down here is it's tempting, like I said, about Zara to do with Spain and Portugal. It's tempting just to reshore everything to the EU, for example, so it's closer, so it's in a more regulated environment. However, think about those developing economies. Think about the benefits to China of their rapid economic growth. They are not a poor country, far from it. And India will be one of the top economies in the world very, very soon. Okay, so actually, by reshoring everything to rich countries, the main thing you will do is put prices up to consumers and save some of those jobs in Spain and Portugal, possibly, or Leicester. What about all those jobs in those textile hubs in India, China, Vietnam, and places like that? So social factors, sustainability, you'll know a lot about this. So when I was looking through this, I'm aware of veganism, clearly. I'm aware of when I was at school and someone had a plastic pair of shoes, it was normally because they were poor. Had some myself. So actually nowadays having a plastic pair of shoes is probably because you're in favour of looking after the environment. Now, looking into the fabric that goes, or the materials, sorry, that goes into vegan leather, for example, some of it is oil-based, as in from petrol. Well, that sounds like it's as bad for the environment as the meat-based version, but some of it is based on apple peel, coconut leaves, those sorts of things, which is probably a lot more sustainable. This market is evolving. As more consumers demand eco-friendly products, the suppliers, the manufacturers, will probably try to fill that gap. I might be more willing to pay £100 for a pair of DMs if I'm thinking it's not killing cows. Maybe. Okay, we need to be aware of what goes into it. Some of the papers I've read recommend something like the food labelling standards that we see. So, I know when I pick up a bag of crisps that there's lots of salt and saturated fat in it, and it comes with a colour coding system. Maybe that would be the same with shoes and clothes. Your jumper has been airlifted from mainland China and shipped to an airport near Heathrow. Wouldn't you love to know that? You can make a conscious decision not to buy it. And if consumers don't buy stuff because of that labelling system, they'll start making it in a more environmentally friendly way, hopefully. So, need to be thinking about cheaper synthetics. So if it is cheaper, then what's the impact on the economy? Some people just want cheap clothes. Maybe that's the only thing they can afford, by the way. Okay, this isn't just a choice to buy cheap. Maybe we should be subsidising better clothes for the environment like we do our steel industry. Here's some of the vegan shoes. They're the same price as the others. And here's a description up there. You can pause the video and read the difference between vegetable-based PU and the evil stuff made of petrol. So animal cruelty is not so much in the press nowadays, very big not so long ago, with people throwing paint at people with fur coats and stuff like that. Canada goose, I see some of these walking around school. They were not so long ago in the press because of cruelty to animals. Don't need to go on about this too much. You know how bad this can be. It's about the brand. If Canada Goose is a premium brand of coats, they don't want negative publicity. Okay, artificial versus natural. Well, we've already got lab-made meat. Maybe we'll have lab-made leather, and we'll see where that falls into the ethical battleground that sometimes we hear about in the press. Sustainability, global warming, Blue Planet documentary, like I mentioned earlier. This was fascinating. I wasn't really aware of the things I've mentioned about Zara. I knew they made lots of their clothes in Spain. It's relatively close. I didn't realise they dumped it all on a plane to get it over here nice and quickly. I suppose when you've got these fast fashion, lean production methods, dropping on a plane is probably a lot quicker, and plane travel's really, really cheap nowadays. So maybe the time saved is more beneficial to the supply chain. Okay, so if you think about these short, lean production methods and these just-in-time ordering processes, actually, maybe this is a bit of a consequence of that. I think just-in-time includes a very slow boat from China for most of them, but air travel is a lot cheaper than it used to be. So Zara, I found this, sorry you can't see the heading there, and the thicker the line, the more they use it. So, so a lot of stuff is just being shipped out, and a lot of materials are being shipped in, which is fascinating. So we've got Zara using more and more Asian-based manufacturing hubs, and also they ship a lot, for example, to New York. So, and I'm presume they don't make a lot of stuff in New York and bring it back. So actually we can see centralized distribution, very important, economies of scale, specialization, all the wonderful things we talk about. However, what about the distribution after I've centralized it? Doesn't look good for Zara. So obsolescence is a fascinating topic, which I'm sure we will explore more in class. But, you know, have you ever bought a t-shirt and washed it twice and it's all shrunk or misshaped? And is this built-in obsolescence or is it just cheap material? I've always put it down to cheap material, to be honest with you. However, just before the Christmas break, I bought myself a couple of jumpers in this sale, of course, and one of these jumpers was meant to be, before the discount clearly, about £120. Within 3 washes, the neck was stretched out, and and I followed the instructions. So is that cheap being branded as expensive, or is it just me not being able to wash clothes? You can decide. So we've got this built-in obsolescence, and this is a product lifecycle question. Looking into some of the models that are out there for this industry, we can see that we've got the R&D stage down here somewhere. We're not selling anything. We're keeping up to date with all the trends and fabrics and what the social media influencers and the royal family are wearing and stuff. And then we get it to market. Now, it could be that we have 3 product life cycles of different seasons of clothes running not at the same time but overlapping each other, which would make sense because you want to still be selling certain things. Now, some of these product life cycles are going to be longer or shorter than others. It could be that we have this really rapid introduction and growth stage as something comes out, and it's the summer t-shirts, I don't know, bright pink for the beach or something. I think I walked past a Primark window last summer and it's like we were back in the 1990s. So loads and loads of pink, short-term fashion cycle, very quickly goes to decline stage. You don't want to be stuck with old stock, so they start selling it off cheap maybe, or it gets to a point where you don't want to sell it off cheaply, not Primark, but some of the luxury companies that might just set fire to it. They start to phase the stuff out. Maybe they send it to some of their discounts. Maybe Primark has got a warehouse that they sell stuff off cheaply. They're out. Can't remember the term now. Anyway, outlet. So it's been a long day. So they're trying to get rid of this stuff, and they keep discounting it, and then eventually they shred it or recycle it or burn it. This is where it starts to become obsolescent, and having it on the shelves could actually be bad for brand image. If you pop into your local Disney store, for example, and you take stuff back, you should ask them what they're going to do with it, because there's a great big shredder at the back of the shop, because Disney don't want you to have slightly damaged products or discount things because you might think it's a substandard product. They would much rather shred your lovely snow globe that's an unwanted product than they would resell it to anyone. If you didn't know that, you do now. Will you still buy Disney products? You shouldn't, until they sort themselves out. So obsolescence is there straight away. Now, if you can actually reduce this product life cycle, so people are buying new t-shirts. Yes, we will have this pile of, I don't have anything to wear because none of it fits me anymore, or it's out of fashion, or it's not what Kate Middleton's wearing at the moment. That's brilliant business, because I can constantly sell you stuff. If I make you clothes that will last you for 10 years, maybe you never come back. Yeah. I've got a very, very well-made coat that I've had for, it's now a gardening coat, but I've had it for about 20 years. It still hasn't got holes in it. It still works. It hasn't fallen apart. I bought it because it was a very good brand. And it is. But I haven't bought another coat since. Yes, it was expensive in the first place, but if it was slightly less expensive, and maybe fell apart after 3 years, maybe I would still love it and just buy another one. There's a risk there, isn't there? Who knows? It wasn't from Primark though. So, social factors, organic versus inorganic, and this is where we talk about the supply chain. With the wonderful world of COVID, we're all aware of what PPE is. I'm loving this guy's PPE, bare flesh, no gloves, and this very advanced breathing equipment that he has with this big box of chemicals on his back. But at least I can get a £2 t-shirt. So, and I'm joking, by the way. So, as it says there, the dirtiest crop in the world, and we know that there's a big growth in organic everything, organic cotton, organic cucumbers, not that I'm wearing any of those, and all of those sorts of things, but I don't know. It's all about crop yields. If I can get as much yield out of a field, that means I lower the cost of my cotton going into my